My name is Jacques Couture, and our maple operation is called Couture's Maple Shop and Bed and Breakfast. We live in Westfield, Vermont. Doing some forest management, we like to keep some dead trees like that one because that attracts birds, because there's bugs in dead trees that eat just rotten wood, and when the birds come in and feed on that, they also stop for hors d'oeuvres sometimes on other trees for some bugs that could be defoliating, and they eat those. So it's to our advantage to keep some of the dead wood just to keep all the birds coming in the woods. It's good for the health of the forest. Yeah, so this area used to be almost all pine. And if you look around, you see a lot of dead, old, rotten stumps that are probably 25, 30 years old, some 40. It makes 50 years that we're farming here. So when we started farming here, this was just mostly pine trees in here, and spruce and softwoods. And we removed those carefully without smashing the little maples. And now we're tapping a lot of these maple trees, and there's a lot more in a few years that will be big enough to tap. So we try to conserve that. That's the future of the sugar bush, is to be able to propagate more maple trees. But we don't remove all the species. We like to have a combination of species so that the forest is not so subject to some kind of defoliation. If you have a pest that comes in that loves maple and you have nothing but maple, they say, oh, yum, yum, here's a feast. But when we have still a few pine trees and a few other kinds of hardwood, we have some yellow birch, some cherry, some ash, beech. We try to keep a good population of all the species. But we do favor maples because that's what we're looking to get. So we have a combination of sugar maples and red maples here on this farm. And if a red maple is competing against a sugar maple, it'll end up in the woodshed. But if it's not competing, we tap those trees. The sugar content is slightly below the sugar maples, but still worth tapping. And so right in this area, there are quite a few red maples, but a lot of sugar maples as well. So this tree in front of me is a beautiful little sugar maple that's just a few years away from being big enough to tap. Right next to it is a black cherry. You know, again, as I said before, we like to keep still a pretty good mix of trees in the woods so that there's a good variety. Just good for the health of the forest. The whole farm is 425 acres, about 185 acres of forest. And the sugaring that we're doing covers about 120 acres on our farm. We tap 7,500 taps. Now, if I was in here though, with my chainsaw, I would do a little bit of thinning right here. So this one is kind of the dominant one here, and I would probably remove a couple of these. I would pick maybe this one to leave and remove these two, just to give them a little bit more space to grow. Because if they're too crowded, they don't grow as fast, they don't get as bushy. We like to give them a little bit of chance to grow so that they have more leaves, because that's what helps to grow the sugar. So when my parents bought this farm, I was 13 years old. And I can remember this particular tree right here. We used to come and play in the woods and stuff. That tree is, I'll get closer to it, you'll get more feel for it. It's probably about, I don't know, well over 30 inches in diameter. I remember when this tree was 4 inches in diameter. you know, going back in the early 60s. And now it's a beautiful sugar maple producing very sweet sap. Kind of fun to remember those things. And you don't remember every tree, but there's certain ones, because of where they're positioned, I've always remembered this one. Now this is an old timer. It looks pretty rough, but it's still got some good sound wood. We get sap out of it. We've got a lot of photographs of this tree over the years. So when I stand right next to it, you get a sense for how big it is, you know? My arms probably stretch about 5.5 feet, and the tree's wider than that. Yeah, we call it the grandfather tree. That's kind of a name that we gave it. We have a few others up there that are, you know, pretty big, but not as big as this. There's no question, and there's some truth to this, there's no question there's different flavors of syrup from farm to farm, from county to county, and state to state. And that's not because we do things better or somebody else does something not so good. It's because of the soils. Different types of soil will have different minerals, and the flavor of the syrup will be a little bit different. So, you know, there's definitely going to be some differences there and some similarities. We all take sap from the maple tree and concentrate it, and so we're really all doing kind of the same thing. So you know, it's not as our syrup better or not as good or what have you. For me, what's important is that the customer thinks it's good, and they keep coming back. And customers like people who consume wines, for instance, in certain regions of the country or of the world are renowned for their flavors in wines. I think there's a similarity in the maple syrup industry as well. Flavors that are enhanced, or you know, that are caused maybe by the soils, by the climate, slight changes, differences in climates, definitely affect the flavor of maple syrup. And if our customers think it's good, that's all I need to know. So this morning it's kind of chilly here. There's an old saying that somebody made up, not me for sure, but I remembered it, is that when the wind blows from the east, sap flows the least. And this morning we have an east wind. They say that when wind blows from the west, sap flows the best. So hopefully tomorrow the wind's blowing from the west. So behind me there's an example of some of our maple trees. As I said a little bit earlier, we start tapping the trees when they're about 8 inches or so in diameter. And as they get bigger, once they reach maybe 30 inches in diameter, if they look like they're pretty sound and a good healthy tree, we'll add a second tap to them. We have some really big trees, 3 or 4 feet in diameter. Some of those, the most we put on any tree is 3 taps. Some of those really big ones. But we don't have many that are above 2 taps. So the majority of our trees are 1 tappers. So every tap that we put in the tree is a hole, it's a wound, so the less of that we can do, the better. So our lines are all set up to run downhill, sap flows downhill. We use vacuum on the lines, but everything is set up to flow by gravity down to the sugar house. This is the tap that's on the tree. We drill a hole 5/16 of an inch in diameter by about 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches deep. And we attach the tap to the tree. There's a drop line for every tap that goes from the spout down to the lateral that goes to the main line. So there's a T there, it goes into the main line, there's a connection on here, and then the sap flows down the hill to the sugar house. So it saves us from having to go up in the woods and gather sap with buckets like we used to back in the old days. So I'm old enough to remember all the steps of that. As a child, I remember riding on the sleigh that had a sap tank on it, and you know, my dad and his helpers would gather sap. And then when I was big enough to carry a sap bucket, I got into it too and did that for quite a few years. When we started sugaring on this farm, once Pauline and I bought the farm, we were using buckets as well at the beginning until about 1979, and since then it's all been plastic tubing. And we wouldn't want to go back. The history here that we know about is that in 1951, the people who had this sugar place, they had it all cut off. They had all the logs cut off and sold for timber. And So then a lot of what we have here today is another growth, another generation of maples that have grown, and some of the really big trees that you see here were not good quality for logs, and that's why they left them. So we have a lot of younger trees on this farm. I'll show you right there how we manage that so it keeps our roads from washing out too much. We have water bars, and this is something a few years ago in 1997, we had a big rain event here, and it washed a lot of things out. I mean, a lot of things. So we came back up with a dozer and we did some water bars so that, you know, then the water, if it starts going down, it has a place to escape. So there's one, actually there's one right behind you, right there. This spring, when that all melts, I'm gonna come back and make sure it's working. You see how there's a little bit of a... So what happens sometimes when the snow is beginning to melt, some of it goes over. But this right here, but we have to manage those things, you know, like in the spring when the snow's all gone, I'm gonna come in with a shovel here and fix that so the water coming from there will go down there. You can see some of it had gone over here, but then there's another water bar right there. So it cuts the water off so it doesn't go down the hill. Main lines here are some of our bigger lines that go up to the other end of the sugar place, and we have some of these vacuum boosters every now and then. The top line is just a vacuum line, and it takes the air out of the line. So what comes out of the tree is about half sap and half carbon dioxide. So with the air and the sap in the line, sometimes it causes constriction. So if we can pull the air out of it and have just sap in the lower line, you can deliver vacuum further in the woods, and that's what this is about. So we have these every so often where there's a main line that pulls in. So this line that goes up that way goes underground for a little ways so that it doesn't bother for our tractor roads. And just like these go underground for a little ways down here as we get to the sugar house.